Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Wysopal. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Veracode. I started out my career in software security as a vulnerability researcher, actually as a hobbyist. And then I changed my career to application security, became a consultant. And then 15 years ago in 2006, I founded Veracode to automate application security testing. So I'm very happy to talk to you today about AppSec's future and the rise of the Chief Product Security Officer.
And hi, I'm Josh Corman. I wear a lot of hats. My current one is one I did not expect, but I'm currently serving for 1 year to help drive the COVID response and the pandemic response for CISA, our nation's newest agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. A lot of what we're going to be talking today about draws from much of the career that Chris and I have been on a journey for application security and product security, including significant chunks of this come from the increased demand for product security officers or an elevated role for some of the elevated risks that associate with what we used to do as hobbies or maybe application specific work. Also from some of the work I've done as the founder of IamTheCavalry.org, a grassroots volunteer effort focused where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood, and some of these higher consequence failures as the world increasingly depends on connected digital infrastructure. So let's jump in. Between the time we submitted this talk in the face of significant technical disruptions and opportunities and in the face of significant public policy changes and higher consequence failures, significantly more has happened. Software trustworthiness, or rather the lack of trustworthiness, is on the forefront of everyone's mind right now. In fact, even just now, we're seeing an executive order from the White House putting significant effort and investment across several government agencies to improve the trustworthiness of digital infrastructure and software, where compromises have dramatically affected both the executive branch and other federal agencies, but also the private sector. With this increased dependence on connected technology, the impact is becoming unacceptably high. So whether it's SolarWinds related activities, whether it's the exchange exploitation, whether it's rampant ransomware on hospitals impeding healthcare delivery during a pandemic with life and blood in the line, this is a time for somber reflection and bold action. And it reminded me of the seminal trustworthy computing memo from Bill Gates at Microsoft that ultimately led to the formation of their market-leading software development lifecycle for Agile, their SDLA. And sometimes you kind of have to be sick and tired of being sick and tired or hit rock bottom and realize that if you don't make your software and digital infrastructure trustworthy, you're going to have significant harm, but also you're going to lose market share. And I wonder if we're now on the cusp of a trustworthy critical infrastructure computing memo. And this has certainly become a top line issue. It's going to software supply chains and transparency will be much hotter than they were even when we submitted this talk in the first place. So that begs the question, is there kind of a pathos for software engineering? We like to use the term engineering, but we don't often apply engineering rigor or accountability or a pathos. Just like doctors take a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, and physical engineers also understand the awesome responsibility that comes with creating things out of steel and concrete, we haven't really found our footing. And in that vacuum, we have maybe some alternatives. So one of them might be move fast and break things. Unfortunately, that might also include democracies. If you've seen films or takes and movements coming out of things like The Social Dilemma, we haven't fully internalized the consequences of some of the actions we take with our software and adoption of technology. Perhaps it's other exemplars from the VC community. If you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched too late, right? These are the things on the hearts and minds of engineering students that come out of college or open source projects and want to start creating that digital infrastructure that we all depend upon. But picture if the people who built a bridge or a skyscraper thought, if you're not embarrassed by the riveting and the construction of the bridge the day you opened it, then you waited too long. And we have learned through high consequence failures in physical engineering, and I'm hoping we will find our footing and our pathos for what it's going to take for digital infrastructure. Because as the world increasingly depends on that digital infrastructure, they're increasingly depending on you and this area of application and product security that we've been foraging. Now, we attempted to do something during RSA conference. I think it was 2008 at a Greylock party. I got sick of the fact that the Agile manifesto didn't mention attackers or threat or risk or security or anything. So we said we should come up with a replacement like the Rugged Software Manifesto. And without reading the whole thing, the idea was to have a personal recognition of, I recognize my code will be used in ways I cannot anticipate, in ways it was not designed and for longer than it was ever intended, or that my code will be attacked by talented and persistent adversaries. And while it didn't take off initially, it did eventually find some purchase in the DevOps community who wanted to be mean to their code and be more nimble and agile and faster and better. So one of my co-authors of that, David Rice, who had written a book called Geekonomics, he said the one line he wished he put into his book, so I put it here now, is that the problem in software engineering is sometimes we treat it like engineering, like we're building bridges, and sometimes we treat it like an art project, like put something on the canvas, you'll figure it out later, be creative. And it's really both. It's art, but with engineering consequences. And we've not fully come to terms with that. And as such, software and application security is a tiny minority of the overall cybersecurity spend, and certainly a tiny minority of the software engineering discipline. But that's going to change. And through a lot of my testimonies and work through Eye in the Cavalry, I've kind of honed on this, and it was painstakingly worded over time, but through overdependence on undependable IT, we've created the conditions such that the actions of any single outlier, any accident or adversary can have a profound and asymmetric impact on human life, economic, and national security. And this is something that's unfortunately revealing itself more recently. Now, when we founded the Cavalry, we met a law professor, Andrea Matwishin. She's very active in the policy community, worked with both Chris and I. And she said, Josh, no one's going to listen to you until there's literally a burning river on fire. She said, we had so much pollution in the Cuyahoga River that it had to catch on fire, not once, not twice, but this river caught on fire 21 times across 70 years before there was a public enough is enough. And they instituted the Clean Water Act and eventually the EPA. And so we talked about the Cyber Cuyahoga River on fire moment. And whether it's a single attack on Ukrainian power plants or whether it's some of these more damaging attacks on US hospitals during the pandemic response, these fires have happened enough. And I think SolarWind and its related activity really captivated the attention and political will of many stakeholders in government. So in response, when we're over trusting of software, perhaps the trust we place upon software should be proportional to the trustworthiness of it and the consequences of failure if it were to prove untrustworthy. So if you're a Game of Thrones fan, I've been saying for a few years now that transparency is coming, because one of the core pillars of trust and trustworthiness is greater levels of transparency across the board. And if you've been following some of the work that many of us have been doing for, I think now 8 years, SBOM is coming. In fact, SBOM is here, and to spell that out, it's the software bill of materials concept. It's already been a requirement for medical devices through the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. There's been a almost 3-year process with the software and transparency project under the National Telecommunications Infrastructure Administration under Alan Friedman. But now it's looks like it's like table stakes for selling high consequence software to the federal government. Okay,
so I think Mark Andreessen was obviously very prescient when he said software continues to eat the world. Software is everywhere. Everyone is online. We have new hardware and software solutions that didn't even exist 10 years ago when Mark said this. The other thing is the software that's eating the world now is different than the software we had in the past. Software in the past was really first started off as ways to automate manual processes in the back office of a business. Think of the bank teller software. So the teller is not writing in a ledger, the bank teller is using software, but that's back office automation, and the risks are different. for things that are just applications in the back office versus things which we would now call products that are delivering value to a customer, right? It could be just an online banking app, which makes it more convenient to do something was traditional, or something completely new, like an Alexa IoT device, which really can't even work without the internet connected to it. So this continuing to eat the world is not just more software, it's different kind of software. And that's one of the reasons we're talking about a chief product security officer today, as opposed to just a CISO that might be, worrying about, compliance and protecting a business's brand. If you go to the next one here. So I put this in here because, you may have played Oregon Trail. You may have ended the game this way. And the thing about, software eating the world is it's taking over processes that maybe used to be manual or used to be back office software and adding a lot of risk to them. Like that mobile banking app is riskier than going into the bank and talking to the teller using the back office software. The attack surface is bigger. Anyone perhaps in the world can download that or connect to the APIs on the back end. So this kind of software we're building now is actually adding a lot more risk to the world, and we have to be careful about how we're doing it. So why do we need a chief product security officer? I used Beast here because my original superhero turned out to be a supervillain, and Josh had to correct me, being the expert he is. You can tell by his back wall there. But the idea is we need this new individual to do something that spans many different departments now. It spans engineering, it spans compliance. It might span your supplier management. It certainly spans information risk. But it's changing, and we're not sure that the CISO model really fits for what's needed for the future. So that's why we're really calling for a CPSO now.
Yeah, and because the problems are increasingly a beast, we need you to become a beast of the best kind, a heroic beast from the X-Men. And there's significant market evolution that's naturally observable. Many of these safety critical product lines and highly regulated lines like medical device makers and industrial environments have already been adding, whether it's a chief product security officer or a head of product security, that is often a peer to or even a superior to the CISO, who's doing more enterprise security or operational risk management. And in part, it's because the software failure has been growing in volume, variety, and impact. I didn't think I'd ever be saying this, but we are in fact seeing national security level cybersecurity failures from a series of accidents and adversaries in nation states. And regulators, of course, domestically and internationally and in the private sector are taking notice and taking action. So at least in my last pre-government role, I was a chief security officer, but with a heavy bent to product security. And it was in addition to our traditional CISO and governance teams. So we had pretty much every board meeting had an update on some level of this program and evolution. And to further speak to Signal, one of those hats I wear is I've been with the CMU CISO certificate program in their grad school since its inception. And we were asked to change an entire module to the rise of the chief product security officer. And this is a snapshot. We will not be going through this entire outline. These are many, many, many hours of chunks of lessons here, but while they complement and they relate to a lot of your traditional AppSec, they are significantly different, more programmatic, involve a lot of third-party risk management and risk prioritization and introductions of things like P-certs and vulnerability disclosure programs and the like. And part of this, we'll both speak to, is This also requires someone, if you're thinking of your career path, you can go down the path of more hands-on and more pen testing or more security product evaluation. You can get more into risk. It often requires someone who can be bimodal and think of this both as a forest and a trees kind of an issue. And maybe you have 100 applications. They're not all of equal risk. Some sort of objective, repeatable criterion can help you decide which ones need which level of rigor and why. And Socratically, going from executive stakeholder to stakeholder to help determine those criterion and get them to advocate, champion, and back the investments that may be required here. But also we're in the face of significant turbulent technological changes, and these may be either threats to your old program or maybe even opportunities for you to insert and up-level your game and find a new career path.
Yeah, there are a lot of people that might be in the middle of this with their skill set. And essentially you have to, if you're going to be the CPSO, you have to go in both directions, right? You have to engage with the individual developer and get that individual developer to, find and fix the vulnerabilities in the code that they're doing. That's very, very focused on simple things, basically, in the code. And that needs to be enabled. But on the other hand, you need to take a bigger picture. A lot of things in the view of risk. If I think about, some of the work I've done in the past for software companies, it was all about just get rid of the high risk bugs, get rid of the critical bugs, get rid of the SQL injections, get rid of the buffer overflows, without really thinking about the broader picture of what is the actual risk if there is a vulnerability in this application. How does it impact our customers, whether our customers are, using on-premise software or they're like a mobile app, or our customers are using, a SaaS application that we're essentially giving them. The enterprise risk management is something that, CISOs know a lot about. And that's kind of the way that they view the world, but it's not the way a lot of product security teams have traditionally viewed the world in the past. So the CPSO is going to need to bulk up in both of these areas. I want to talk about the attack surface growing exponentially, because I really think that this is one of the key things that's making product security more risky, because products are exposed, right, by default. Like on the left there, we have an IoT device. That IoT device could be 5G, it could be Wi-Fi. It's just hanging out there on the internet exposed. It has to secure its own attack surface, and that's an increasing model for a piece of code, that it has to be on a device like this exposed. Same thing with APIs. If you're exposing an API, a back end for a mobile app, or maybe you're a SaaS company that exposes an API to their customers, obviously that needs to be secured. But the thing is, the way we're constructing applications now, APIs are now the way are sort of the bloodstream of an application. They pervade all the all inside of a piece of software, and each microservice or serverless or container or public API is more attack surface that needs to be thought about. Social networking is a way that we are interacting with applications now. Applications and products are sending, they're communicating to social media, and social media is also going the other way. So it's just another piece of attack surface that is growing. And finally, on the right there, I just show a picture of a website. But the idea is old software never seems to be deprecated, and it just hangs around, and its attack surface never goes away. So we build something new, we leave something old around. How many organizations have moved to Office 365 for their email, but still have an Exchange server running somewhere for some reason for a few mailboxes or something internally? You have the attack surface of both O365 and Exchange because you migrated. So that's definitely something that needs to be tackled. Obviously, we want to understand if breaches are coming through applications, and they certainly are. Verizon said 43% of single-page applications represent were the cause of breaches, and that is that's sort of the mainstay of how we interact with applications these days. And 70% of all applications have a security flaw in them that has been inherited by open source. So these are just some of the ways the world is changing that product security officers need to deal with. So there are technology trends that are impacting the CPSO. These are technology trends that developers are all taking advantage of because they allow them to go faster and build better applications more inexpensively. But they are also something that CPSOs need to learn about and can take advantage of. Upskill yourself and understand these trends to get ahead of them. And some of these trends actually make security better. A lot of times we look at what developers are doing using new things like serverless or infrastructure as code, and we start worrying like, oh no, now it's added risk. Well, actually, a lot of these new technologies can benefit security, which I think is an awesome thing. So if we think about ubiquitous connectivity, this is just the standard mode for any product now. It's likely that products are communicating to multiple sites on the internet. I looked at a healthcare mobile app that was written by a major hospital, and it was communicating with 7 backend APIs, including one in China. So the connectivity is great. It allows us to quickly add a lot of value to, say, something like a mobile app. But it also means that there's a lot more attack surface that's persistent, and there's a lot more pieces to secure. The other big trend, abstraction and componentization, is where we're using, instead of writing code, we're using a library, or we are writing a script that is instructing something else to be built, or we are calling an API, and who knows what's behind that API. It's abstracted away from us. And this abstraction and componentization is great to build apps more quickly, but it changes the way you have to think about security. There's much more thinking about supply chain. So picking your suppliers, whether they're open source suppliers or API suppliers, your cloud provider is going to be giving you APIs. That starts to be a supply chain issue. It's nothing an individual developer is typically going to worry about. This is something that needs to be thought of by the CPSO. And just here's an example of how we've always had supply chain security concerns, but it really, in the last 5+ years, has radically changed what it means to be an application. A legacy application might have a few libraries and called a couple APIs. Modern applications can be 95% libraries and be calling hundreds of APIs from dozens of different providers. So it just radically is changing the way you have to think about securing that code.
Yeah, and one of those innovations that came out of the Bill Gates Trustworthy Computing memo was Howard doing the seminal work on the Microsoft SDL, and I often use it as a framework. Perhaps you like OSAM or some other chain here, but to talk about the different activities as you shift right or shift left, all the way from threat modeling and secure architecture requirements through maybe your coordinated vulnerability response program and PCERT. But as we talk about this and we try to make sure that we're meeting acceptable levels of due care, especially as if we're selling high consequence software or software that touches regulated data or your customer's intellectual property, as these are more productized versus just apps, they bear more responsibility. And many of you have tried to be very, very, very diligent about doing at least industry standard practices here, including things that Chris and others have pioneered. But what we haven't really thought about is if you're in the software supply chain land, the world of SBOM, blink and you'll miss this beautiful animation. With all these different parts, this notion of a software bill of materials is really stolen from Deming and Toyota supply chains in the 40s. And BOMs themselves, or bill of materials, are a pretty necessary productivity and profit enhancer for most of these manufacturer and chemical companies in the world over the last several decades. The idea of a software bill of materials and software supply chain hygiene and software risk management is that we're all in a supply chain. Most of us are in the middle. This graphic was made for the NTA process with Audie and myself and others. And that's a bedside infusion pump. So if you're the product officer, a chief product security officer for a medical device that can pump drugs into somebody and maybe give them a lethal dose, just like the first recall in history for a medical device, without authorization could empty the contents of a bolus in 3 seconds instead of 3 hours. That product you're selling is sold in hospitals and operational risk environments. But while you make the product, you have a supply chain. Your supply chain has a supply chain. It's turtles on turtles all the way down. And risks anywhere in that supply chain, even if they're opaque to you, can still cause a disruption. This was really punctuated 2 DEFCONs ago with Urgent 11. There was a vulnerability announced in some Wind River and VxWorks code. And everyone said, okay, do I use that? Nope, I don't. I'm safe. But it was later subsequently revealed to be in Interpeak IPNet stack, which was deeper in the supply chain and used by tons of other real-time operating systems and high safety assurance devices. So a flaw way down in the bowels there may manifest and create exploitable attack surface that can harm people downstream. So if it's daunting enough for all the great work you've done in AppSec to drive an SDLC, Chris and I had this moment of dread where we realized, wow, not only do you need a software bill of materials to tell you what's in it, do we actually know the rigor or lack thereof or the SDLC for every part and project that you're building? And of course you don't. And of course there's ways to mitigate against less visible and less known risks. But this is going to lead to an era where we can start to scrutinize the quality caliber more like Deming. We've focused at SBOM on the am I affected, where am I affected parts of the manifest. But part of his brilliance was using fewer and better suppliers of parts, the higher quality parts suppliers, and the least vulnerable versions of those. So this epiphany means that as we're going to try to make sure that we can meet the needs of regulatory requirements, we're also going to have to pay a little bit more attention to the only using the freshest of ingredients in the food that we produce, so to speak. And you can learn a ton more about SBOMs elsewhere, but we're not talking about revolutionary things here. The minimum baseline component information identified from the consensus documents were essentially 7 fields that can be spit out as an automated byproduct of your build process with most modern tools and plugins. And the goal here is that this machine readable, machine generated artifact follows code along for a number of stakeholders and use cases up and down that supply chain. And many of those materials, including some brand new ones yesterday, have been added to nta.gov/SBOM with your taxpayer dollars funding that project.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of these changes in the way products are being built and deployed, because they, could be introducing risk, but they also can be used to help us secure the product. So if you think about a lot of the cloud native technology, it's essentially compartmentalizing pieces of an application to in a container or serverless or as other composable infrastructure that's provided by your cloud provider. And it's all driven by infrastructure as code. So infrastructure as code is able to describe what the environment is that your code that you're writing will be running in. And what this means is we can start to secure all these things that used to only have a known state in deployment. We had to scan it in deployment, and people could change that in deployment. We can start to scan that upstream back in the development process, which should make it cheaper to deploy secure infrastructure in production. So what you can do is you can scan your IAC, your Terraform, your CloudFormation scripts, and that can give you the context that all your code is running in. And this should help you eliminate false positives, right? If you're just scanning the code, I do this at work all the time. We say, okay, you have a SQL injection here, and the developer will say, yeah, but that database, is trusted. It's not reachable by anything else. There's no vulnerability there. And that's because just by looking at the code, you can't understand the environment the code is running in. Now we can see that, and we can decide not to fix some flaws because the environment is protecting them. The other thing is it allows you to maybe configure the environment differently to block attack surface from getting to a flaw. So this is, once we start understanding infrastructure as code, it allows us to go faster and actually build a more secure product. The other big trend that we need to take advantage of, the CSPO or CPSO, I'll get this right someday, is developers are hyper automating everything. Everything is a script. Everything is code, everything is running in a fully automated way, and any manual process is, damage that needs to be routed around. So as a product security officer, you can start to take advantage of this and move what you need to do as part of the software lifecycle into this everything is code world. So, here are some examples of what you can do. The policy that you have for, whether a defect that's found should break the build and not allow a push to production, that should be written as code. That can be a text file that's analyzed in the pipeline as it's running. We can check these policies in, and we can modify them and maintain them over time the way developers will modify and maintain configuration of their containers or their Kubernetes. So we can start to take our security tooling that used to be disparate processes that sometimes were manual, sometimes were driven by an API, and actually just make them another developer tool that's part of the process. This is something that's very exciting that product security can leverage to go faster and make it cheaper to fix bugs. The other thing we can do in this everything is code world is we can understand what's deployed. We can read all those configuration files. We can read the infrastructure as code, and we don't need to scan production anymore to keep it up to date and configured and patched properly. We can just monitor the threat information space, monitor if a new patch is available or if an open source component has a vulnerability in it, and we can just update that and then run our pipeline. And there's no more scanning of production anymore, and should be faster and cheaper.
Yeah. So we should and often do automate everything. The whole idea of rugged DevOps, or what is now DevSecOps, and the like. Tools like Brakeman from the Twitter guys, tools like Gauntlet from James Wickett and others. If you know the chaos monkey concept from Netflix, they asked a bunch of us to help them write evil weaponized chaos monkeys and the like to be mean to their code. And those types of things are useful. Where you can't, there's still some need for human talent and tabletop exercises. And this is what I usually, when I teach threat modeling, I make people play tower defense games for a little bit before the course starts. So whether it's a simple linear one like Plants vs. Zombies or something else, we talk an awful lot about threat modeling. We don't do a whole lot of threat modeling. And that became painfully clear when the US FDA required a threat model to be published with every new pre-market submission for a medical device. And we realized, oh my goodness, there's 10,000 medical device makers, and there are not 10,000 Atom Shaw stacks. So while there's great books and there's great games and there's been some pioneering work here, we often talk about it more than we do it. And one of the things I found I had to do in my last corporate role was, instead of hiring maybe more breakers or more security analysts, I hired security architects and people who spoke the language of the architecture and software development team, who had street cred with them, but could also get them accustomed to talking through alternative designs before we're committed to a bad project and indefensible architecture. And these were things of just whether it's using the free tools like the Microsoft threat modeling things or some commercial ones, and having a way to really easily drag and drop and visualize alternative trust boundaries instead of using buzzwords and marketing terms like zero trust, actually implementing some of the ideas behind them, like least privilege and trust boundaries and blast radius and things like that. And these have a double opportunity. One, as you're starting to design these things with increased unknowns like APIs and ad hoc mashups and software-defined networking, you can try your best to have some sort of architectural intent to avoid elective complexity. But also, when you ultimately make a mistake or fail, there's a flaw buried in your software supply chain somewhere. Impact analysis in your PCERT can be quite important. If you find there's a new flaw, how bad is it? Where in my trust model is it? And is it going to change the color of my font, or is it going to have a really bad outcome? So understanding the relative impact after you design it well, such that a leak in any compartment of your submarine does not sink the whole ship. And as the aforementioned, one of the things, because we're going to all systems fail, we want to be able to make ourselves put out the welcome mat to invite good faith researchers have the opportunity to report issues to us that they find without fear of legal reprisal. And I'm so thrilled to see over the last several years, a lot of the work that Katie Mazuris and others have done on the ISO standards and pioneering vulnerability disclosures and bug bounty programs have really taken root. But these programs are increasingly present in safety critical regulated areas. There's now a binding operational directive from CISA that all the federal agencies have to do it. And things like this were encouraged in the IoT laws and the like. So putting out a welcome mat means, wouldn't you rather find out about a flaw from a friendly than maybe from an adversary as you're in the news and maybe the subject of congressional action? So these are just skimming the treetops of a lot of the topics covered in a larger discussion on the shifting roles and relative priorities of a chief product security officer. Again, pause this if you like and look at some of that content. There's lots of bodies of work here, and they're not all equally important. And they are not always done in, quote, best practices for traditional AppSec. But we hope to have showed, at least contextualized a little bit of how you might be able to elevate your game, your career, and help protect your companies.
So just to wrap it all up, get a blue suit and a mask, but also take these immediate actions. Read the cybersecurity executive order. Get fluent on some of the things we talked about, like digital transformation, supply chain risk, SBOMs, and the everything is code movement, because you're going to need to use those things.
And then longer term, if this is a career path you're interested in, or if you've already started, you can't do everything everywhere. You can't sprinkle penicillin dust over all the sick patients. So one of the most important things I did, both for executive buy-in and to make sure that we had a repeatable, objective process that wasn't swayed by the winds or climate change or different attitudes or different executive changeover, is really try to come up with some objective criteria to risk tier things, like what's the potential to inflict loss of life or physical harm, what's touching regulated data, what touches a material amount of our revenue. Get the top level concerns of either your board, your chief executive, or your C-suite into a risk ranking metaphor. What I actually found was the exact opposite of what I expected. I thought people would be begging not to get additional rigor. They were fighting to get on a higher tiered importance list. So come up with some good criteria so you can eat the elephant one bite at a time. It's gonna have to involve some sort of third-party risk education curve. And there's lots of schools on this outside of cybersecurity you can borrow and steal from. And there's an increasing body of work there. But you're really also going to have to find champions, because you're not going to get a massive team for this. You're going to have to inspire, inform, and activate the team of Avengers to help you do this. And that's why executive sponsorship is so important. And architecture teams and engineering leadership is table stakes. And depending on the kind of software or application you're talking about, IT on operational leadership as well. And then start small. Introduce pilots on some of those top tier or brand new projects instead of some of the legacy thornier ones, to maybe introduce threat modeling, SBOM procurement language, so you can buy more defensible or procure more defensible platforms as part of your overall product attack surface. But also you're going to be expected to produce them. Remember, we're all in the supply chain. Most of us are in the middle. We're going to be both consuming and producing them. The vulnerability disclosure programs are getting traction. Sometimes you can graduate with incentives to bounties. And then automated security as code is a really great opportunity to take some of the manual, error-prone, and slow process out of things to liberate your time, energy, and political capital to things that are going to be a bit harder or novel. So we hope that you start your journey. Whether you're going to become a chief product security officer, you're going to work with one, or you're really going to perform a subset of those functions, the increased regulatory scrutiny, the increased market demand gives you an opportunity to maybe redefine and forge another career path than you've had thus far. And if Chris or I can be a resource now or in the future, we'd love to be. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.